We all know that the perfect use case for XRP is for it to be used in cross border payments. Those cross border payments are made a lot of the time by remittance companies, but what we're really looking for here is the banks to start using XRP because banks move huge amounts of money. Even just the Bank of England on its own moves $1 trillion a day. These are mind blowing numbers. But when you look at the price of XRP today being around $2.20, you think, are banks actually using XRP? And this is a question that's been in my mind for quite a long time. And I finally got in to do the deep dive research. So that's what we're here doing today. I've actually uncovered a whole load of other things and started to model out different scenarios as a result of this question, because the question in and of itself is actually very easy to answer. It's just very easy. So if you're excited about this video and you want to see more videos like this, please hit the like button, share it with someone who you think needs to see this video, and let's get into it, shall we? So the big question is, are banks actually using XRP to send money across border or even from bank to bank? Are they using it in the first place? The simple answer is yes. The disappointing answer is but they're doing so with such a disappointingly low amount of XRP that it's not really made any meaningful movement in the price. It's not had any meaningful impact on the price. But we do have things that are very exciting about the future. And I want to explain to you here how what we're experiencing right now is that bottom part, the flat part of the hockey stick. And when we talk about the hockey stick, I'll show it on screen. You can see how that looks. This is how parabolic things are built. There's a compounding effect that happens. And I want to get into actually how that happens and what is required around XRP and what is required from an adoption standpoint. And even how much progress have we made as a percentage towards actually achieving that goal. And when you get past that curve on the hockey stick, that's when you start getting to the realm of people defining it as a God candle. It's a real compounding effect. I don't think this is something that's going to happen necessarily overnight. Certainly, this process has to be long and drawn out for it to happen overnight. It's mostly like it's the same kind of thing when you talk about people being an overnight success, when really, in reality, there's probably many, many years before that where they were grinding and grinding and grinding so they could become an overnight success. And it's very much the same here with XRP. So let's get into some of these numbers. So the way banks move their money, banks have this interesting thing called payment corridors. These payment corridors are set up to basically designate money movement patterns to say, okay, if we're in the USA and we want to send money to Mexico, the USA to Mexico payment corridor is its own thing. And you can have specific deals that work through there, different softwares that work through that corridor specifically. That's a hint for in just a second. But really what we have is 5 main payment corridors that are where XRP is actually being used. Now, I'm going to mention 5 here because these are the largest payment corridors where it is confirmed that XRP is being used for value transfer in those payment corridors. Outside of that, there are actually 40 that we know about, but we don't have any specific data about the payments in those corridors. We just can assume that they're probably less than this. It's unlikely that they're more. But what I found in the research is that the reason why there isn't data for these other 40 payment corridors and how much volume is going through them is because there's a lot of NDAs involved. Like banks don't necessarily ever announce that there's a new payment corridor and we're testing in this payment corridor. That's actually not a normal thing to announce because they just treat it as just, this is day-to-day functioning, right? They're just updating systems here and there. But the ones we know about and we have verifiable data from are these ones. The US to Mexico, which is actually the largest payment corridor that utilizes XRP. That might be surprising for many people. So over the course of 2023, $4.3 trillion only, this being the most that any payment, the largest corridor that we have for XRP, $4.3 billion over the course of the year. Not a lot at all. Then we've got Japan and Philippines, Japan and Vietnam, Japan and Indonesia, and the UK and Europe to Philippines. So as you can see, Japan populates 3 of the top 5 there. We're going to get into Japan in a second here. But I was surprised to see that the US and Mexico was the highest usage of XRP in this way. And they're doing so not via banks. This is the really interesting thing. None of these top 5 are done by banks. And so when we look at payment corridors for banks in Japan, they're not happening. They're not happening at a scale that where they've published and are significant. And sorry, there was an error here in what I said. The UK to Philippines is actually the highest out of all of these top five, and it's $36 billion in 2022. That's how much money they move. So they range everywhere from 36 billion all the way down to 1.8 billion over the course of a year. Because they're not banks, they're actually remittances companies, like you've got MoneyGram or Bitso, for example. And that comes after the relationship that was built between Ripple and Bitso. But as I was trying to say, none of those companies in the top five, none of those payment corridors were done using banks. They were all using remittance companies. And this highlights exactly what Ripple's strategy is here. They are primarily going for remittance companies. And once their case has been proven with remittance companies, then you start expanding into banking. And I think they've already proven it with remittances, and they're starting the testing with banks. And banks are testing these payment corridors on such small volumes that it's kind of astonishing. So, with that said, just in that top five, you got 36 billion, 10 billion, 13 billion, 2 billion, 4 billion. We're not looking at more than $50 billion that has been done in ODL using XRP. $50 billion. That is minuscule in volume. And that is done over the last, from what I can see in this list, that's been done over the last 5 years. Barely anything has happened with on-demand liquidity using XRP. Now, that is not always going to be the case, and we're going to get there. I want to show you the list of all the other payment corridors on the screen here from my research. Another thing to understand here is that just because a company or a remittance company or a bank is using RippleNet, for example, doesn't necessarily mean they're using XRP for it. This is where the data gets really blurry and it's very difficult to understand. And so typically, a company or a corridor won't announce that they're using on-demand liquidity until the numbers are meaningful enough. And that's simply where we are. So if it feels like nothing has happened, it's because we are at the tip of the iceberg. We haven't even gone under the water yet to see the monstrous beast that is being built underneath. And so what I'm trying to say is that there shouldn't be frustration here that the price hasn't moved. We're literally on the flat part of that hockey stick. It hasn't even started to move up yet. It's going to feel the most painful. It's the same with anything that's worth doing. It's going to take a long time to do over a long period of time. Then there's going to be some momentum built. And then all of a sudden, it's kind of just taking off. And what I found really interesting here is that Japan, by the end of 2025, has said that 90% of the payments out of Japan are going to be made using XRP. That means all the remittances, basically. It means 90% of all the remittance payments. It means 90% of all bank payments cross-border. And so this is the type of thing to where the inflection point happens. If Japan goes 90% in, that's a huge amount of money. And so it really got me to thinking, well, if Japan is going to commit to this 90% of all payments going out of Japan using XRP, what does that mean? How much volume are we talking about? And so I split it up into two different elements. There's remittance payments and there's trade payments. And so what we're looking at here, because Japan does monstrous numbers overall, remittances isn't really actually that much. There's not much money coming out of Japan to the rest of the world in remittances. And that total 6.75 billion would represent 90% of what they typically export in remittances. But the trade payments is the super interesting part here. And that ends up being $67.5 billion that represents the 90% of what they do over the course of a year. This is all annualized. So overall, $74.25 billion a year. That is the entirety of what has happened with ODL in ODL's history, essentially, in terms of volume, in a single year. Still not that much. Right, so I know we're looking at this Japan thing, but based on as like a very exciting thing, and it absolutely is the inflection point where other countries start to adopt the same way that Japan has done. But I want to emphasize how even a country like Japan, which is a very strong economy, even if they take over 90%, it really doesn't do anything meaningful to the XRP price. And that's extremely frustrating, only because we're in this time period where we're at that inflection point. I don't want to keep droning on about that part. So after all the modeling out, basically what I've discovered is if you want to reach a $100 XRP sustainably just using cross-border payments and on-demand liquidity and XRP being used in those transfers, you basically need $432 trillion all the way up to a quadrillion dollars to be moved every year using XRP. That is a ton of money. And that's just a $100 XRP. So Japan's involvement in that basically equates to 0.017% of what is required in terms of the velocity of XRP. I want you to look at this as in terms of the progress towards having a $100 XRP purely because of this element, because of the cross-border payments element and its impact on supply and demand in the XRP space. I would also look at that as a progress bar. We're less than 1%. Our progress is less than 1% towards a $100 XRP when you're purely looking at payments cross-border in this way. So it seems to me that it's very clear that the impact of banks using XRP for the pure purpose of sending value isn't a sufficient price driver to create the values that we're looking for. When you look at $1,000 XRP, $10,000 XRP, you simply cannot get there with payments alone. There have to be other elements of this that coincide and meet in a perfect storm to allow this to happen. And one of those things that I've been thinking, well, I always try to put myself in the mind of a business or a bank, or even just kind of the environment that's created after these things happen. So let's talk about the Japan thing. Let's say Japan do get to their goal of using XRP 90% of the time for all their payments in trade and remittances, right? Let's say they do that. Well, that creates an environment where other countries are looking at Japan. And you might think what I've been saying is contradicting the hockey stick and also how difficult it is to get to $100. There is no contradiction here because it's the environment that's created when things start rolling out that creates the hockey puck, which creates that God candle. And it creates kind of this unbelievable thing to happen, which in many ways might be a one of a kind. But we can use other instances that have happened in the world of business and anything to kind of model it against. But the environment that's created when Japan goes 90% and they have a great time and they spend way less money and it costs them way less and it's way quicker and they get a good reputation for sending payments, that starts to be contagious. Fortunately, we've got countries that are looking into this just like Japan are, with CBDCs and all the different ways that they interact with Ripple. But they're all experimenting. They'll all go through this experimentation phase where they're using very small volumes of money to go through these payment corridors. And that will slowly grow and it will grow and it will grow. Eventually, you'll have 90% of the countries operating 90% of their payments through XRP, right? But we know that just that isn't a sufficient price driver for XRP to reach the values that everyone hopes for. It's just simply not enough. But the environment impacts other reactions. I talk about this a lot in my program. It's like there are stimuli out in the world. Those stimuli make us feel a certain way chemically. The chemicals make us inclined to act a certain way, and our actions create the environment again, and that becomes the new stimuli. So it's like a circle. If countries are looking at other countries adopting a really good technology and they want to use it, clearly somewhere along the line there's going to be an incentive to invest because they're going to see the growth of this company in Ripple. They're going to see the use of the software that they use, which is XRP, and they're going to think we probably should hold some of this. And we talk about this at length. I've talked about it with Molly Elmore quite a lot. She talks about this a lot. It's called the virtuous cycle. And the virtuous cycle means, once one person kind of says, wait, this is going to be really valuable. This is really valuable. I'm going to buy some of this. And, tie that into the whole idea that banks no longer need Nostro Vostro accounts. And these Nostro Vostro accounts hold billions and billions of dollars worth of other currencies in the bank, like waiting to be used. They're no longer needed. So where are those billions of dollars going to go? Probably into an investment that they know is a really good investment because they've had experience with it and they use it. I think XRP fits that mold. And I think other assets fit that mold too. I think Bitcoin fits that mold. Ethereum, as much as I hate to admit it, will probably fit that mold. You got XLM, XRP. There'll be a bundle of assets, likely the assets that Trump talked about, when I put it that way. When Trump said there's going to be that list of assets in reserve, that's the kind of formulation of a portfolio that big banks will use as investments, countries will use in their reserves, and it is that is the price driver. So the payment system is the catalyst for the environment for the price to be driven up due to the potential of XRP, not just as a use case or a utility asset, but as a growth asset, as an investment. And so that's what creates the straight up, the God candle, whatever it is, because what you're doing is you're purchasing massive amounts of XRP off the circulating supply, removing them. And when you remove supply, but the demand is increasing, supply and demand, that equals the higher price. And so that, for me, that's the moment when you start throwing the idea of market cap out the window in many ways. At least in the ranges that we've been accustomed to seeing, because it might not necessarily follow that path. Maybe that's a question we'll tackle in another video. But something I've been tackling every day for basically the last year as my block flow program turns 1 is all the issues that investors just like yourself are facing on a day-to-day basis about building strategies, building portfolios, doing it the right way, making it feel aligned to the way you view the world, but then also planning for the next evolution of this generational wealth story that you're building. I want you to know 2 really important things right now that I'm really excited about. One is that we're accepting a small group of new individuals into the group. But also, we've just launched module number 1 of the new wealth system. And the new wealth system is an A to Z, no stone goes unturned kind of course that teaches you how to build a wealth plan for generational wealth. We're talking about tax, we're talking about estate planning, we're talking about how you even write the email to the accountant you want to work with, everything. It's all encompassing, how to buy businesses, how to do charitable giving, how to structure a will, all of that for generational wealth. Module number 1 has just come out, and I think there's 9 more to go. So it's going to be very interesting. Now's a great time to get through the strategic thinking and then into this formulation of your plan moving forward for generational wealth. And it really is giving you all the tools to turn this bull run into a lifetime of wealth and freedom. So if you're interested, just got to answer a few questions. Just click the link below. Jump on a call with me. We'll talk to see if you're a good fit. And if it is a good fit, then the program will get you the results. It's wonderful. Anyway, that's it. Thank you for watching this video. Subscribe for more videos just like this. Stay emotionless, and I'll see you in the next one.